Welcome to Damon Revenge Stories. Get ready for tales of sweet revenge.
My name is Finley Blanchard. I'm 44 years old, and on a Tuesday in October, I sat in my truck in the parking lot of a self-storage facility on the south side of Memphis, holding a small brass key I had almost thrown into a Goodwill bin 2 years earlier. It was the kind of key that looks like it belongs to nothing. The cheap stamped kind that comes with a filing cabinet bought at an office supply store in 1987. My grandfather's name was scratched into the bow with what looked like a pocket knife. The rain on the windshield made the whole world look like it was running. I hadn't slept in 3 days. My landlord had left a voicemail that morning that I had played 7 times. And somewhere on the storage unit's second row, in a unit I had been paying $89 a month to keep sealed since my grandfather's funeral, there was a filing cabinet I had never opened. I sat there a long time before I went in. I want to tell you what I found in that cabinet rewrote 19 years of my life. But to make you understand why my hands were shaking on a steering wheel in a parking lot in the rain, I have to back up. Welcome back to the channel. If you've ever realized somewhere past the middle of your life that the people you trusted most were the ones quietly running a meter on you, this is the kind of story we tell here. Stories about people who finally see clearly, and what it costs, and what it gives back. If anything in the next hour lands close to home, do me one favor before we go any further. Hit the like button, hit subscribe, and drop the name of your city in the comments so I know where you're listening from tonight. I read them. I always read them. Now, to understand how I ended up in that parking lot with that key, you have to go back to a kitchen in Memphis, Tennessee, in the summer of 1999, when a 25-year-old version of me sat at a table with his parents and signed a piece of paper that he thought meant they loved him. I had just graduated. I had a job offer from a structural engineering firm downtown, a starting salary that felt like monopoly money, to a kid who'd worked construction summers since he was 16, and no credit. My mother brought out a folder. She had this way of bringing out folders that made you feel like she had already done the hard part for you. Inside was a lease for a 1-bedroom apartment in Midtown and a co-signer form. My father stood behind her with his hand on the back of her chair, the way he always stood, like the photograph of a man who supported his wife. They said the landlord wanted parents on the paperwork because I was young. They said it was just a formality. They said, and I remember the exact words, because they came back to me 20 years later in a different voice. "We just want to make sure you're protected, honey." I signed. I thanked them. I bought my mother a bouquet of grocery store roses that weekend, and she put them in a vase on the counter and said, "See, this is how a family works." What I didn't understand at 25, what I wouldn't understand until I was 44, was that co-signing gave them access. Not legal access to my account, not exactly, but the kind of soft access that comes from being on every piece of paper, every emergency contact form, every utility. My mother started calling the bank to verify charges she'd seen on my statements. She knew my statements because I gave her the password to my online banking the year I got the flu and needed her to pay my rent on time. I never changed it. Who changes a password on their own mother? 5 years went by like that. I told myself I had the kind of mom who cared. My friends from college had moms who barely called. Mine called every Sunday. She'd ask about work. And then somewhere in the middle of the conversation, she'd mention that she'd seen I'd spent $200 at a restaurant on Friday. And was everything okay? Was I being careful with money? Was I drinking too much? Was the girl I was seeing the right kind of girl? I'd get off the phone feeling watched and tell myself it was love. At 30, my grandfather died. His name was Walter Blanchard, and he was the only adult in my childhood who didn't talk to me like I was a project. He drove a 1986 Chevy pickup, drank his coffee black, and when I was 8 years old and crying because my father had thrown out a model airplane I'd spent a month building, my grandfather sat me down at his kitchen table and said, "Finley, your daddy is the kind of man who breaks things he doesn't understand. You're going to spend your life building. Don't ever let him tell you otherwise." I thought about that sentence at his funeral. I thought about it standing in the church parking lot, while my mother arranged the flowers, while my father shook the pastor's hand, while my Aunt Diane wiped lipstick off her tooth in the side mirror of her car. My grandfather had left me a small duplex on a side street in East Memphis. $1,800 a month rental property, fully tenanted, paid off. The lawyer read the will and my mother actually gasped like she was surprised. Like she hadn't been at the hospital the week before talking to my grandfather alone in the room with the door closed. After the funeral, in that kitchen with the folder I should have learned to fear by then, she said the property was going to be a headache. Property management companies took 30%. Tenants called at 3 a.m. about leaking pipes. Did I have the time with my engineering career taking off? Did I really? My father said, "Son, let your mother handle it. She's got the time." She loved Grandpa too. I signed another piece of paper, a property management agreement, naming her as my agent, with full authority to collect rent and pay expenses. I thanked them. I bought them a card. For 8 years, my mother told me the property barely broke even. There were repairs. There was a new water heater. The tenant was late. Property taxes had gone up. Every quarter, she'd hand me a printed statement showing a balance of $300, $200, sometimes nothing at all. I never asked to see the bank records. Who asks to see the bank records of their own mother? At $1,800 a month, over 8 years, she collected $172,800 of my money. I learned that number later, sitting in an attorney's office, and the attorney had to wait for me to breathe before he kept reading. At 35, I made a mistake worse than the previous two combined. I had started a small consulting side business doing structural assessments for residential renovations, and I opened a business checking account at the same bank where I kept my personal accounts. My mother said, "Finley, what if something happens to you? What if you're in an accident and bills need to be paid? Let me be on the account just for emergencies, just in case," I added her. Over 4 years in increments small enough to look like overhead, 300 here, 800 there, a few 4-figure transfers labeled as office supplies or contractor payments to companies that didn't exist. She pulled $47,000 out of that account. I noticed it eventually. I noticed it the year I tried to file my business taxes and the numbers didn't match anything my accountant had on file. I asked her about it. She cried. She said she'd been embarrassed, that my father had been laid off briefly, and they didn't want to worry me, that she had always intended to pay it back. I told her not to worry about it. I told her I'd been blessed, and they deserved to be supported in their retirement. I bought her a Mother's Day card that said, "Thank you for everything." I thanked her. I keep noticing how many times I thanked her. Then my marriage fell apart. I won't tell you whose fault that was because I'm not sure anymore. I think the truth is somewhere between two tired people who stopped being curious about each other. But I will tell you that during the custody hearings, my father took the stand as a character witness. I had assumed for my side. He testified for hers. He sat in that wooden chair in a navy blue suit my mother had picked out and told a family court judge that I lacked emotional stability, that I had always struggled with regulating my anger, that he and my mother had been concerned for years. None of it was true. None of a single sentence of it was true. I sat at the table next to my attorney, and I watched my father look at me one time, very briefly, and I saw nothing in his face. Not guilt, not apology, just the calm satisfaction of a man finishing a task. My ex-wife got primary custody and moved with our son to Little Rock 3 hours west. I got every other weekend, alternating holidays, and the right to call him on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. After the hearing, my mother hugged me in the courthouse hallway and said, "Your father was just trying to be honest, sweetheart. He loves you. He just wants what's best for the baby." My son was 7. He was not a baby. I hugged her back. I drove home and I sat in my apartment and I drank a glass of bourbon and I called my father and I told him I forgave him. I cannot tell you why I called him. I cannot tell you why I forgave him. I can only tell you that some patterns in a life are so old, they feel like weather. At 40, they befriended my landlord. They lived in a different part of town, but my mother had a way of finding people. She brought him a coffee cake. She introduced herself as Finley's mom, just checking in. Just wanted to know if there was anything we should know about how he's Daisy. How are you? Over the next 2 years, she called him at least 9 times that I know of, and probably more that I don't. She reported noise complaints I never made noise to cause. She told him I had been seen stumbling in the parking lot. She suggested that I might be having episodes. My landlord, who was a fundamentally decent man named Mr. Halverson, started keeping a file. He told me later he didn't believe her. He told me later he kept the file because he thought one day I might need to see it. At 42, they did something I still cannot say out loud without my chest going tight. My son was 9. He came to Memphis for a weekend visit with me. And on the Saturday afternoon, I dropped him at my parents' house for 2 hours so I could finish a structural report that was due Monday. When I picked him up, he was quiet. On the drive home, he said, "Dad, do you actually want me? Or do you just want to hurt Mom?" I pulled the truck over. I pulled it over on Poplar Avenue with the hazards on and traffic going around me. And I turned to my 9-year-old son and I asked him who told him that. He said, Grandma. He said Grandma had told him during a coloring book session at the kitchen table while Grandpa watched football in the next room. He repeated it the following week to his school counselor in Little Rock, and I got a call from the counselor asking if everything was okay at home. I told her everything was okay. I lied to a child protection professional because my brain had not yet caught up with what my parents were. At 43, they called my engineering firm. They left a message with the HR director, my mother's voice, calm, concerned. "We just thought you should know," saying that I had been drinking again. I had never been drinking in the first place. There was nothing to be, again. The firm was required to investigate. They pulled me into a conference room with the managing partner, an HR, and a lawyer, and they asked me about my drinking history and my mental health, and whether I was fit to sign off on load calculations for structures the public would walk underneath. I sat there for 40 minutes answering questions about a problem that did not exist, that had been invented by my mother, and the entire time I was thinking, and this is what I keep coming back to, I was thinking, I have to call her after this. She'll be so worried about me. That was the brain I was operating with. That was 19 years of conditioning. They cleared me. The HR director, a woman named Marisol, who has since become one of the most important people in my life, walked me to my truck after the meeting and said quietly, "Finley, whoever called us also called the licensing board and another firm in town. You should know that. It wasn't one call. It was 3. 3? The number sat in my mouth for a week. 3 institutions. My mother had not made a mistake. My mother had made a campaign. I want to stop here for a second, because if you're still with me, if you're still listening, I want to ask you something. If someone controls you by making you believe you're helpless without them, that's not love. That's inventory management. Have you ever replayed a voicemail and heard who someone really is? Because that's what comes next. It was a Sunday in September. I was supposed to drive to my parents' house for dinner. I didn't want to go. I had been not wanting to go for months, but I always went. That Sunday, I called my mother to say I was running late, and she answered, said, "Hold on, sweetheart. Let me find your father." And then I heard the clatter of her setting the phone down on what sounded like the kitchen counter, and I heard her walk away, and I heard her not hang up. The line stayed open. I could hear the sound of dishes. I could hear my Aunt Diane's voice. In the background, I could hear my mother walk back into the room and say something that I will carry to my grave. She said to my aunt, in the kind of voice you use when you think nobody is listening, He'll never leave. Where would he go? He thinks we're all he has. That's the whole point. Then my Aunt Diane laughed, and my mother laughed with her. And the laugh was the kind of laugh that means a long-running joke. My father said something I couldn't quite make out, and my mother said back, "He'd be nothing without us. We built him, and he doesn't even know it." Then the line clicked and went dead. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of a Walgreens for 45 minutes. I did not cry. I did not call back. I did not drive to dinner. I drove home and I sat on my couch and I did nothing for the rest of the night. My hands were shaking before I pressed play on that voicemail. Because here's what I haven't told you. My phone, which had been in my pocket the whole time, had been recording. I have a transcription app I use for work meetings, and it had been running. The whole thing was on my phone. Every word. I pressed play. I listened to my mother's laugh 5 times in a row. The next morning I called Mr. Halverson, my landlord. I asked if my mother had ever left him any voicemails. He said yes. He said he had saved them. He said he had been wondering when I'd ask. He emailed me 3 of them by 10 a.m. The most recent one was from the previous Wednesday. In it, my mother told him I had been behaving erratically, that she was concerned for the safety of the other tenants, that she thought he should consider alternative arrangements. She said the word psychologically unstable. She said the word evict. And she said it in a tone of voice I had been hearing my whole life. A tone of voice that sounded like worry and was, in fact, an instrument. I listened to that voicemail 4 times. Then I drove to a coffee shop and sat there for 2 hours, and I did the thing I had not let myself do in 19 years. I started writing it down. Every favor, every loan, every 4 emergencies, every check, every Sunday dinner, every comment about my drinking I dismissed because I didn't drink. Every time my father had testified or implied or rolled his eyes. By the time the coffee shop closed, I had 11 pages. That same week, and this is what I mean when I say a life sometimes goes off a cliff and lands in a place it should have been all along. That same week, a letter arrived at my apartment from a law firm in Nashville. The letter was about a life insurance policy. My grandfather, Walter Blanchard, had carried a $220,000 policy through a mutual association of small business owners he'd belonged to since the 1970s. The policy had been paid out 4 years ago. The named beneficiary, according to my parents at the time of the funeral, had been my grandmother, who had died 6 months before my grandfather. And after her death, the policy had defaulted to the estate, which my parents had handled. They had told me there was no policy. They had told me, when I asked once, that Grandpa had let it lapse in the 1990s. The letter in my hand said something else. It said the Nashville firm had been engaged by a Vernon Kessler, executor of a private trust, to notify potential beneficiaries that certain assets associated with the estate of Walter J. Blanchard had been subject to potential misrepresentation, and that I should contact them at my earliest convenience. I read the letter 4 times. I did not know who Vernon Kessler was. I did know that name from somewhere. I sat with it for an hour before it came back to me. Vernon was my grandfather's old business partner from the 50s and 60s, the man who had retired to a small house in Bartlett and sent my grandfather Christmas cards every year until he died. Vernon was a CPA. Vernon had been at the funeral. Vernon had hugged me at the graveside and said, "Your grandpa loved you more than he ever loved anyone, son. Don't forget that." I had forgotten that. I called the Nashville number. The receptionist asked if I could come up in person. I drove to Nashville the next morning. The attorney, a soft-spoken man in his 60s named Mr. Pruitt, sat me down in a conference room and slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were documents I am still, 2 years later, learning to read without my hands shaking. There was a copy of the life insurance policy. The beneficiary line did not say my grandmother. It did not say the estate. C'est pour. It said, in my grandfather's handwriting, Finley R. Blanchard Soul. There was a check stub showing that the policy had been paid out in February of the year after my grandfather's death, $220,000, into an account at a Memphis credit union in the name of the Wolf-Wolter. Cellsall, the Walter J. Blanchard Family Trust. There was a copy of the trust document. The trust had 2 trustees, my mother and my father. The trust had 1 beneficiary, me. I looked at the document for a long time. I asked Mr. Pruitt if I could have a glass of water. He brought it. He waited. He told me gently that the trust appeared to have been substantially depleted over the past 4 years through a series of distributions that did not appear to have ever reached me. The current balance as of last month was $11,318. He set down his pen and said, Mr. Blanchard, I have to tell you, this notarization on the original trust paperwork, the one your parents filed to gain access, this notarization is fraudulent. Your mother is the notary of record on her own beneficiary paperwork. That's not legal. That's a crime. Your mother could lose her license. I sat in that conference room, and I did not cry. I drove back to Memphis. I called Vernon Kessler. Vernon lived in a tidy ranch house on a cul-de-sac in Bartlett, with a magnolia tree in the front yard and a brass mailbox shaped like a heron. He was 78, thin and tall, with hands that had a slight tremor and eyes that did not. He answered the door in a button-down shirt tucked into pressed slacks at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. He looked at me for a long moment before he said, I knew you'd come. I just didn't know when. I sat in his living room. He brought me coffee in a mug that said, Memphis Tigers. He listened to the entire story. I told him about the property, the business account, the divorce testimony, the landlord, the engineering firm, the voicemail in the parking lot. I played the recording for him. I watched a 78-year-old man cover his mouth with his hand. When it was over, he sat very still for a long time. Then he said, I promised your grandfather I would stay out of family business. I gave him my word. He shook his head. I have kept that promise for 4 years. I'm done keeping it. He stood up and walked to a small wooden secretary desk in the corner of his living room, the kind with a roll top, and he pulled a brass key out of his shirt pocket. A key, I noticed, that looked very much like the one I had inherited in a box of my grandfather's belongings 2 years earlier and almost thrown away. He unlocked the bottom drawer. He pulled out a manila folder. He brought it to me. Inside was a second original unaltered copy of the trust document, properly notarized, witnessed by Vernon himself, and a second CPA, naming me as sole beneficiary, with my grandfather's signature in ballpoint pen at the bottom, and a handwritten note clipped to it. The note said, Vernon, if my boy ever comes asking, give him this. Don't let his folks know you have it. They are not who they pretend to be. I am sorry I didn't see it sooner. Watch out for Finley. He's the only good thing I made. Vernon said, very quietly, your grandfather made me keep this because he didn't trust your parents either. 3 months later, I would understand why Vernon kept that drawer locked. That Tuesday, I just thought he was sentimental. I sat in his living room for 2 more hours. The afternoon light came in slantwise through the Venetian blinds and laid itself across the carpet in long, pale bars. There was a clock on the mantel that ticked the way old clocks tick, a little behind the second, as if it had decided long ago not to be in a hurry. The coffee in the Memphis Tigers mug went cold in my hand, and I kept holding it anyway, because the weight of it was something to hold. The mug had a chip on the rim that I worried with my thumbnail without meaning to. There was a small framed photograph on the end table beside me, black and white. 2 young men in shirt sleeves, standing in front of a brick storefront, with a hand-painted sign above the door. One of them was Vernon. The other was my grandfather. They were both grinning, the kind of grin men only grin when they are 26 years old and have just signed the lease on their first piece of the world. I had never seen that photograph before. I had never been told that storefront existed. Vernon pulled out files I didn't know existed. He had been keeping records, quietly, methodically, the way a retired CPA keeps records. He had been tracking my grandfather's holdings since the funeral, watching the trust distributions, calling the credit union once a quarter under a pretext to verify the balance, waiting. He showed me a spreadsheet. The columns were hand-ruled in pencil and then gone over in pen. The way a man trained in the 60s still does math when he's doing it for someone he loves. The paper had the soft, fibrous feel of ledger stock that had been folded and refolded into the same creases for years. He showed me the date and amount of every withdrawal my parents had made from the trust. He showed me one withdrawal of $38,000 in March of last year, the same week my parents bought a new bass boat. I had seen the boat. I had helped my father back the trailer down a ramp at Pickwick Lake. I had complimented the upholstery. I had said the word gorgeous. I remembered saying it. I remembered my father's small, satisfied nod, the kind of nod a man gives when he has gotten away with something and wants you to admire him for it without knowing what he got away with. I remembered the smell of the new vinyl seats in the sun. I remembered him handing me a cold beer from the cooler and clinking the neck of his bottle against mine and saying, "To Sundays." That had been 7 months ago. The trust had been bleeding for 3 years before that. He showed me the rental income records, too. Not the false statements my mother had given me, but the real numbers, pulled from the duplex's tenant, who Vernon had, very carefully, befriended over the years through a mutual friend at church. The tenant had been paying $1,800 a month, on time, for 8 years, through an automatic transfer into an account in my mother's name. $172,800, plus the trust, plus the business account, plus the credit card charges I would later discover. I had a pen in my shirt pocket. I took it out. I wrote the numbers on the back of an envelope Vernon slid across the coffee table, and I added them twice, because the first time I did not trust my own arithmetic. The pen was a cheap blue ballpoint with a chewed cap, and the ink skipped on the third line, and I had to trace over the 7 so it would read clean. The number, when I added it all up that night, was $341,000. I underlined it. I underlined it twice. I sat with the pen still in my hand. I had rehearsed many shapes for the size of the betrayal in the months leading up to this, but I had not rehearsed a number. The number was its own kind of weapon. That is what my parents had taken from me, not counting the divorce, not counting the lies, not counting my son. I drove home from Vernon's house with the second trust document on the passenger seat in a manila envelope. And I parked in my apartment lot, and I sat in the truck. And for the first time in my adult life, I let myself cry the way I had needed to cry for 19 years. Ryan had stopped sometime during the drive. The pavement under the parking lot lamps was the color of wet slate. A neighbor's cat crossed in front of the truck and stopped and looked at me through the windshield with the unimpressed expression, "Cats reserved for grown men weeping in vehicles." I did not turn the engine off for a long time. The heater hummed. The wipers, which I had forgotten to switch off, dragged once across the dry glass and squeaked, and I left them. The squeak became a rhythm. The rhythm became a kind of company. I cried the way a man cries when he has finally laid down a weight he did not know he was carrying. Quietly, with his hands on the wheel and his forehead against his hands, while the heater pushed dry air across his wet face. Not for what they had taken, for who I had thought they be asi, or asiwe, samburai. So there is a difference. I want anyone listening to know there is a difference. The money you can replace, the mother you thought you had, that one stays gone. The week before Thanksgiving, my mother showed up at my apartment with a homemade chess pie. I had not been answering her calls for 6 weeks. I had not been to a Sunday dinner. I had stopped depositing my paychecks into the joint account she had access to. I had, very quietly, with Mr. Pruitt's help, begun moving things around. She knocked on the door at 6 p.m. with the pie in a glass dish covered with plastic wrap and her best church coat on and her hair freshly set. I knew the knock before I knew it was her. 3 quick raps, a pause, then one more, like the rhythm of an idea she had practiced. I looked through the peephole and saw her standing under the yellow porch light. The pie held out in front of her at chest height, like an offering, her face arranged in the expression she had used my whole life when she wanted something. Behind her, the porch light caught the small moths circling it, and one of them had landed on the shoulder of her coat without her noticing. She said, "Sweetheart, I've been so worried. Daddy and I have been so worried. Won't you let me in for just 5 minutes?" I let her in. I'll tell you why I let her in. I let her in because I wanted to see it. I wanted to see her perform it one more time now that I knew. She sat on my couch. She set the pie on the coffee table. The plastic wrap had a small bead of condensation under it where the crust met the dish, and I watched that bead while she talked, because looking at her face directly felt like staring into a sun I had finally learned was not warming me. The bead slid 1/4 of an inch down the inside of the wrap and stopped. The dish was the same Pyrex dish she had used for casseroles when I was 12 years old. I recognized the chip on the corner where my father had set it down too hard on the stove one Christmas. She told me she'd been thinking about how distant I'd been, and how she knew I was going through a hard time, and how she and Daddy were always there for me, and how she just wanted to make sure I knew she loved me. She smiled when she handed me the pie. The same smile she used when lying to my son's counselor. I noticed for the first time in my life the small muscle that pulled at the left corner of her mouth a half second before the rest of the smile arrived. It was the tell of a woman who had decided what her face would do before her face did it. I had rehearsed this silence for 6 months. I let it sit in the room with us for a long beat before I answered. I counted to 10 in my head before I spoke. She watched me count. She did not know I was counting. She thought I was searching for the right, grateful word. I told her thank you. I told her I'd been busy at work. I told her I'd see her at Thanksgiving. The lie came out of my mouth easier than it ever had before, because I finally understood it was a lie. And a lie you know you are telling is a different animal than a lie you believe. I walked her to the door. She paused on the threshold and turned back and tried, one more time, to catch my eye with the warm, worried look she had used my whole life to reel me back in. I looked at her. I did not look away. She looked away first. The pause was the longest she had ever given me. I watched her drive away. The taillights bent around the corner of the building and disappeared, and the parking lot went quiet. And somewhere down the row, a car alarm chirped once and stopped. I stood at the open door for another minute. The cold November air came into the apartment and settled on the rug. Then I went back inside and I called Mr. Halverson, my landlord, and he said, "Finley, you're not going to believe this, but your mother just left me a voicemail 20 minutes ago. She said you were having a breakdown and might need to be removed from the premises for your own safety. Do you want me to send you the recording?" I said, "Yes, please." The audio file came in by text within the minute. I sat on the edge of my kitchen counter with my phone in my hand, and I pressed play, and I listened to my mother's voice, the same voice that had told me 40 minutes earlier that she loved me, described to a man she had never met, that her own son was a danger to others. 20 minutes. She had pulled out of my parking lot, pulled into the next one over, and made the call before her engine cooled. 3 hours after she sat on my couch pretending to love me, she called my landlord and tried again to have me evicted. The voicemail was 91 seconds long. I timed it. In the background of the recording, I could hear the turn signal of her car ticking. I could hear the small chime that her dashboard makes when a seatbelt is unbuckled. She had not even waited to get home. I did not eat the pie. I gave it to a neighbor who said it was the best chess pie she'd ever had. I told her to enjoy it. I did not tell her where it had come from. Some things I was learning, you do not need to explain. I did not call my parents on Thanksgiving. I did not call them on Christmas. I did not call them to explain. The phone rang on Thanksgiving morning at 9:17, and I let it ring. It rang again at 10:04. It rang again at noon. By the third call, I had turned the ringer off. I sat at my kitchen table with a turkey sandwich from the deli down the street and a glass of cold milk, and I read a paperback novel I had been meaning to finish since June. The novel was not very good. The sandwich was excellent. The bread was a soft rye with caraway seeds that caught between my teeth, and the mustard had the sharp grain mustard bite I had been raised to think of as too fancy. I ate it slowly. I read 3 chapters. The radiator under the window ticked the way old radiators tick. Outside, somewhere on the next block, a family was setting up a folding table in a driveway and laughing about it. I listened to their laughter without envy. That was new. I went to my attorney's office on the first Monday of the new year, and I signed paperwork that transferred the duplex into my name only, terminated my mother's authority as property manager, redirected the tenant's rent payments to a new account, closed the joint business account, opened a new one at a different bank, canceled the credit card my parents had been using for the country club and the church donations and the boat fuel and the cable bill and the dental work and the steakhouse dinners I had unknowingly been paying for since 2008. The attorney slid each document across the desk, one at a time, the way Mr. Pruitt had slid the manila folder months before, and each signature I made felt like cutting a string I had not known was tied to my ankle. The pen was a heavy black thing with the firm's name etched on the barrel. The desk was walnut. The clock on the wall above the attorney's shoulder read 11:07 when I started, and 12:43 when I finished. I filed a formal complaint with the Tennessee Secretary of State's office against my mother's notary license. With the supporting documentation Mr. Pruitt and Vernon had assembled, I filed a separate civil claim for the missing trust funds. I changed the locks on my apartment. I changed my phone number. I did not call them. I did not write them. I did not give them the courtesy of an explanation. They had not given me the courtesy of one for 19 years. The day after I signed the new lease on my new apartment, my parents drove to my old one and discovered an empty unit. Mr. Halverson told them, very politely, that I had moved and had asked him not to share my forwarding address. He said my mother stood in the parking lot for a long time, looking up at the dark window. He said she said the word Finley out loud twice, the way you call a dog you are not sure has gone deaf. He said my father sat in the car with the engine running and the radio off and his hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, like he was waiting for a light to change. He said neither of them spoke when they finally drove away. 43 seconds passed, he told me, between when my mother got back in the passenger seat and when my father shifted the car into reverse. He had counted, he said, because he didn't know what else to do with himself while he watched them through the office window. He told me my mother knocked on the office door before they left and asked, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound casual, whether the new tenant might have a forwarding address. He told her no. She thanked him. She stood there a second longer than was comfortable. Then she turned and chinned off Ortha. Whoa. Got up, back to the car with her shoulders set the way a woman sets her shoulders when she is choosing not to look back. The fall happened the way Vernon had predicted it would happen. He called it gravity. He said, "Finley, when you stop holding people up, gravity does the rest." The duplex rent that had been funding their lifestyle for 8 years stopped flowing into my mother's account on the 1st of February. By the 15th, the country club called them about the lapsed dues. By the end of the month, the cable was off, the boat slip fee was past due, and the credit card my mother had been using for groceries at the upscale market on Sanderlin had been declined twice at the register in front of women she went to church with. I am told she stood at the register the second time with a cart full of items and a face going slowly red, and the cashier had to call the manager, and the manager had to ask in a low voice if she would like to put any of the items back. I am told she left the cart in the aisle and walked out without speaking. The church treasurer pulled them aside after a Sunday service in February and said, gently, that there appeared to be a discrepancy in their pledge records. The donations they had been credited with for years had, upon review, been coming from a credit card in their son's name. The church treasurer looked at the records, then looked at my father, and quietly closed the ledger. I am told my father did not speak. I am told my mother said, "There must be some mistake." And the treasurer said, "Yes, ma'am, I believe there must." And then he excused himself and walked back toward the sanctuary without giving her the second sentence she was waiting for. She stood there in the fellowship hall, in her good Sunday coat, with her hand on the back of a folding chair, and waited for the second sentence, and the second sentence never came. My father's small contracting business lost its only reliable engineering subcontractor, me, when I declined to renew our informal arrangement, and my firm formally ended the relationship after I disclosed the conflict to my managing partner. 2 of his standing clients drifted away within the quarter when their permits stalled at the city for lack of a stamped letter he could no longer produce on a phone call. A third client, a home builder out in Collierville who had been giving him steady work for 11 years, called him in early April to say he was going to go a different direction. 3 neighbors who had watched the family dynamic for years, who had heard my mother's voice carry across summer evenings, who had seen my son's face on the rare weekends he came to Memphis, began to talk to each other. I know because one of them, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Castellanos, who lived 2 doors down from my parents, found my number through Vernon and called me one afternoon to say, "Honey, I just wanted you to know. We see you. We always saw you. I'm sorry it took us this long to say so." She said it in the voice of a woman who had graded a great many essays and knew the difference between a sentence that meant something and a sentence that did not. I thanked her. I sat on the porch after we hung up, and I let the words sit on the table between me and the evening. The evening light came in low through the magnolia and laid itself across the porch boards in stripes. A neighbor's wind chime moved once and went quiet. My mother sent a letter through her sister. Aunt Diane delivered it to Vernon, who delivered it to me without comment. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten on stationery with bluebirds in the corner, and it was the most extraordinary document I have ever read. The handwriting was the same handwriting that had signed my permission slips in elementary school. The same loops on the lowercase l, the same exaggerated capital F at the front of my name, the same small heart she had always drawn instead of a dot over the I in Finley. It explained that there had been misunderstandings, that I had always been sensitive, that she and my father had only ever wanted what was best for me, that the trust funds had been managed on my behalf for tax purposes, that the rental income had gone toward shared family expenses that I had benefited from indirectly, that my father's testimony at my divorce had been honest, if perhaps poorly worded, and that the calls to my landlord and my engineering firm had been expressions of genuine maternal concern. It did not apologize. Not once, in 4 pages, did the word sorry appear. I read it sitting at the kitchen table in my new apartment. With the afternoon coming toward the window, in a long, warm rectangle on the linoleum, and I felt, for the first time, nothing. Not anger, not grief, nothing. The rectangle of light moved 1.5 inches across the floor while I read. I noticed that. I did not notice my pulse. The letter ended with the sentence, "We are your family. We are the only family you have. Please call your mother." I read it twice. I put it in a folder. I did not respond. 6 months later, she sent another one. I did not read that one. I keep them in a drawer in my office at the duplex. I keep them because someday, when my son is older, I may need to show him what it looks like when someone refuses to know what they have done. The summer after all of this, on a custody weekend in late June, my son came to Memphis to stay with me at the duplex. The tenant on the other side had moved out the month before, and I had taken over the whole property. My whole property now, deeded in my name only, with the title clean and the mortgage paid off 30 years ago by a man who had loved me enough to plan for this. And I was slowly turning it into a home for both of us. I had painted the back bedroom blue because my son's favorite color was blue. Not navy, not sky. The exact medium blue of the cover of his favorite library book about whales, which I had matched at the paint counter at the hardware store by holding the book under the fluorescents until the man behind the desk could mix it. I'd bought a used bunk bed off Facebook Marketplace and assembled it myself with the kind of attention I usually reserve for load-bearing calculations. I had tightened every bolt twice. I had planted a small vegetable garden along the back fence because my grandfather had always kept one, and I wanted my son to see things grow. Tomatoes, 2 kinds of pepper, a row of basil that had already started to bolt because I had not been pinching it back the way I should have. The soil smelled like the soil at my grandfather's house had smelled in 1982. I had not known a smell could keep itself that long. On that Saturday evening in June, after dinner, spaghetti, garlic bread from a paper bag, the kind of meal a 10-year-old will eat without negotiation, my son went out into the backyard to chase fireflies. He was 10 years old by then. He still ran the way little boys run, all elbows and knees and pure, committed velocity. I sat on the back porch with a glass of iced tea, and I watched him. The condensation on the glass ran down over my knuckles and dripped onto the wood of the porch step, and I could feel each drop. The Memphis summer dusk did the thing it does. The long blue going pink at the edges, and the fireflies came up out of the grass, like the yard itself was breathing. There must have been 100 of them. They blinked at intervals just long enough to make you think you had imagined the last one. Somewhere down the block, a screen door slapped shut. A dog barked once and then thought better of it. My son laughed. He cupped his hands around one and brought it to me to show me, walking carefully so as not to crush it, his face open, in the way a face is open only when it has not yet learned to be otherwise. I looked at the small light in his palms, and I looked at his face, and I thought very clearly, with the kind of clarity that arrives only after a long grief. I miss who I thought my parents were. I mourn people who never existed. But this porch, this boy, this silence, this is what real feels like. He let the firefly go. We watched it climb back up into the air and find the others. He sat down next to me on the porch step and leaned his shoulder against my arm and did not say anything for a long time. Neither did I. The iced tea sweated. The cicadas tuned up in the magnolia at the corner of the yard. He smelled like sweat and grass and the cheap kid shampoo his mother sent in his weekend bag. I let the silence sit on the porch between us, and for once the silence was not something I had to perform. Vernon came over for dinner the next night. He brought a tomato from his own garden and a bottle of root beer for my son. The tomato was the size of my fist and still warm from his kitchen counter. He sat on the porch with me after the boy went to bed and we didn't say much. The yard had gone quiet except for the cicadas and a far-off train somewhere over toward the river. At one point he said, Your grandfather would be proud of you, Finley. I said, I think he is. Vernon nodded. His hand trembled slightly on the arm of the porch chair. The cicadas did their thing. Inside, on my keychain on the kitchen counter, there were 3 keys now. The truck key, the new house key for the duplex, and the small brass filing cabinet key that had once belonged to my grandfather and that had unlocked in a Bartlett living room on a Tuesday afternoon. The proof that I had been loved more carefully than I had ever known. I keep that key on the ring. I touch it sometimes without meaning to. The metal has worn smooth where my thumb rides. It used to be a forgotten relic in a cardboard box. Then, it was proof of love. Now, it is the symbol of a thing I had to learn the hard way. That the people who say they built you sometimes mean they own you. And that the people who actually love you build something for you to inherit when they are gone. My parents are still in Memphis. I see my father once in a while at the hardware store. We do not speak. The last time was in the plumbing aisle in April. He was looking at a length of PVC. I was looking for a wrench. He saw me see him. He set the PVC back on the shelf in the wrong slot and walked the other way down the aisle without picking up whatever he had come in for. My mother, I'm told by Aunt Diane, who I still take a phone call from twice a year, has developed a story she tells at church about an ungrateful son who abandoned his elderly parents during a difficult time in their lives. I do not correct the story. I do not need to. The people who matter, Vernon, Mrs. Castellanos, Mr. Halverson, Marisol from HR, my attorney, my son's mother, who I now have a quiet civil co-parenting relationship with, and my son. Those people know what happened. The state notary board suspended my mother's commission. The civil case for the trust funds settled out of court for an amount that does not undo the harm, but does represent a meaningful acknowledgement. My father's contracting business has shrunk to almost nothing. I do not feel triumph about any of this. I feel the way you feel about weather. It is just what happens when you stop holding up something that was never yours to hold up. I used to think that family was the people who stayed. I was wrong. Family is the people who tell you the truth about what you are worth. And sometimes those people are gone before you understand what they were telling you. I used to think love and loyalty were the same thing. They are not. Loyalty without honesty is just inventory management. And I used to think that being needed was the same as being loved. It is not. Being needed by people who have engineered your dependence is the most expensive kind of loneliness there is. If you are listening to this tonight and something in the back of your mind has been quietly telling you for years that the people closest to you are not who they say they are, please listen to that voice. It is not paranoia. It is not ingratitude. It is the part of you that the people around you have not yet been able to silence. Trust it. According to a 2023 study from the National Domestic Violence Hotline, financial abuse occurs in 99% of domestic abuse cases, and adult family financial exploitation affects an estimated 1 in 18 Americans over the age of 40. You are not the only one. You are not crazy. You are not ungrateful. You are seeing clearly, possibly for the first time, and clarity in a long fog feels exactly like madness. Until you act on it. That's the story. 1 brass key in a cardboard box, 1 voicemail my mother forgot to end, and 1 porch in East Memphis, where a 10-year-old boy chased fireflies in the long blue dusk of a Saturday in June. If any part of this resonated with you tonight, if you have your own version of the voicemail, or the folder on the kitchen table, or the person you mourn who never existed, please share it in the comments below. I read everyone. Someone else reading them needs to know they are not alone. Hit the like button if this story meant something to you. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. And take care of yourself this week. Look at your bank statements. Change your passwords. Call the person who actually shows up for you and tell them thank you. We'll be here next time.